was 8 and my dad ended up passing away from an accidental overdose. I saw my mom kind of progress from having a really big struggle with addiction to overcoming that challenge and coming back to Christ. I'm very grateful for my mom because she didn't give up. And it could have been easy to give up, could have been easy to continue the cycle, but she fought as much as she could. I love the phrase, don't let your circumstances dictate your outcome, because it can help you realize that, like, just because I've had a tattered past doesn't mean I can't have a beautiful future. I've had to carry people that have been shot and died in my arms, and you don't deal with that as a normal human being, and then you're like, how do I even comprehend that your daughter just died, or I have to tell you that, like, yeah, your son's not coming home tonight. And it's just like, man, like, how do I not bring that home even? And I always like to treat people how I would want to be treated. And they talked about that a lot in the academy, is be the police officer that you would want responding to your home. Like, I drive around in my town and sometimes I get flipped off. Sometimes people record me and they don't want to talk to me, or they spit, throw things at me. There's a face behind this protester. There's a face behind this cop. There's a face behind this person, whatever they may be. Like, it's our opportunity to get to know them as who they are, see them. Like we talked about with the addiction, like the homeless individual on the street, they may have children, they may have a family. We should love them like Christ would. The rich person in the mansion, they may have struggles that we may not see. We're all equals. Treat the drug dealer like the soccer mom.
So, who am I and what is Turn Outward? My name is Spencer Smalley, and I'm currently completing my master's in social work in order to become a licensed therapist. I've worked in mental health for 3.5 years now, and I see some concerning trends in mental health that I want to speak out against. Number one, I want to normalize being vulnerable in an online world of comparison where we post about our highs and don't talk about our lows. Number two, I want to change the narrative that we need to heal ourselves before we can help other people. Finding connection and purpose in helping others is crucial to our own healing. Number three, I want to share my faith. David Bednar says that the character of Jesus Christ is to turn out when the natural man would turn inward. Me and my guests share stories of how trusting in a higher power has allowed us to love and serve others in deeper and more meaningful ways. I want to build bridges of belief regardless of someone's underlying religious or spiritual background. I hope you'll join me in my journey of trying to help the world turn outward. Today we have Eddy Saunders. Eddy, how you doing, man?
Good, man. I appreciate being here.
Oh, good to have you here. Eddy has a lot of things going on in his life, so grateful that he's made time for me. He's a recent father, actually.
Yeah, I just have a 3-month-old baby at home, my daughter. She's amazing. Best thing that's happened to me and my wife. Super excited for her.
We'll get a little bit more into that and talk
sure,
a little
for
bit
sure.
more about that. But Eddy is a police officer, and so I thought that he had a lot of interesting perspectives that he can offer during this interview. A lot of similarities in some of my work background, and there's actually some similarities between, police officers and therapists, and so we'll talk a little bit more about that. Super excited.
Absolutely, yeah. We swap hats a lot of times as police officers, as a profession, right? Like, therapist, I take on the hat of a therapist sometimes. You take on the hat of being an authority figure and helping people. So it'll be good to see kind of the perspectives we can share.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, the way that I know Eddy, is we're actually from the same hometown, Harriman. Eddy went to my high school. We kind of had similar social groups, and I kind of seen you around, but I really didn't get to know you until after both of our missions when we were both in college, kind of living in the Orem and Provo area for school. And so we kind of were in the same friend group during the COVID summer, 2020, right? And there was also another girl in our friend group whose name was Swan,
Yeah.
and we were all kind of like hanging out. And I remember like one specific night we were at In-N-Out, and this was like your first time hanging out with
Yeah.
Swan. And I had like joked to them. I was like, "You guys are gonna get married," and I was just being a
Oh, yeah.
goofball, like trying to like tease Eddy a little bit, make him uncomfortable, and all that. But then I ended up, basically prophesying.
Absolutely.
So, and yeah, Swan and Eddy started dating and started getting serious, and then they got engaged and married, and they just had their first kid. So we joked along the time that I manifested it, and all that kind
So
of
are you
stuff.
gonna tell
So,
me now that like I'm gonna have $1 million come in or something? Like it seems to come
dude,
true.
now that you say that,
You
actually,
seem to see, yeah, you seem to have things come true. So just whatever you tell me.
hey, bro, you married Swan, you already got
Facts.
$1 million.
Married
Yeah.
way above my league. No, no, that was funny. We talked about that. Swan and I talked about that all the time. We're like, oh man, Spencer totally called it. Like one of our first times hanging out, he's like, you guys are gonna get married, and we thought it was funny at the time, and then boom, it legitimately happened. So that was awesome. It's fun to look back on. Good times.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely a good memory, and that was a really
Oh
fun
yeah.
summer. We played a lot of
Oh,
gator ball,
absolutely.
which is kind of like a sport that we invented, and did a lot of
Mm-hmm.
fun things
Oh yeah.
together. And so, definitely a good time. And ended up going to your guys' wedding. I think
Yeah.
it was in
Yeah.
August, right? And I had like just barely
Oh, I
bleached
do
my
remember
hair.
that.
Like I,
Yeah. I was like, I remember seeing him like, whoa,
it was,
it was cool. Like it looked good on you.
yeah, dude, it was. I looked like Johnny Bravo or
Yeah.
something. It was. Well, I had like long hair all
Hmm.
summer, just like parted in the middle. And then I just decided randomly that I was gonna cut it like short and then just bleach it. It was like channeling
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
Eminem or something,
Little Slim
my
Shady.
Slim Shady. Um, but yeah, I just showed up to this wedding. Which, by the way, I'm really bad at going to weddings. So if I go to your wedding, it means I
Great.
care.
We were
So
grateful to have you there. I do
I'm
remember you
so
being there. Like, everything else is kind of a blur, like a lot of things, but I'll pick up little memories here and there. And I was like, I do remember Spencer with the cool haircut. I was like, my
yeah,
man.
yeah, dude. I showed up to your wedding, made it about
No, no,
me,
no.
like
We were just grateful
with
to
this
have you.
with crazy hairstyle.
Uh,
Dude,
oh,
that
it
was
was
a
a good
fun
time.
wedding though too. Still remember the
Oh yeah.
dance. Like we
Oh yeah,
got
dude.
down.
It was
We
fun,
got
man.
down.
I think I may have
Yeah.
even tore my shirt or something. Like it was a good time. Yeah,
Oh
grateful for
yeah.
everybody to come. Very grateful.
Yeah. I think it was at another friend's wedding that I like legitimately ripped my
That is
pants.
awesome. That is awesome.
I was just
Dude,
going too hard.
those are the parties you want to have,
Yeah.
especially at a wedding.
Yeah.
Oh man, that's awesome, man.
Anyways. Well, so Eddie, help our listeners help get to know you a little bit better. Tell us a little bit about kind of
Hmm.
your upbringing, your background, and what makes you
Yeah, for
you,
sure,
man.
dude. I grew up in Utah, so I can't say that I'm one of those cool cats that grew up living across the United States or in different places. So I was born and raised in Salt Lake County. Moved around a bunch in Salt Lake County. We went to Harriman High School, right? So I went to a bunch of different elementary, middle schools, and then ended up in Harriman. That's where my mom raised. There was four of us in my family. So I grew up with an older sister. She's 4.5 years older than me. My mom and dad. Uh, Growing up, had a little tough childhood. I'm not complaining at all. Just a different background. My dad struggled with anger, and so he had a lot of issues with my mom. He had a lot of instances where he was, hurting. A lot of domestic violence, I guess, would be the great way to say it. My mom and dad were on the way outs for divorce when I was 8, and my dad ended up passing away from an accidental overdose, I believe on methadone. And my mom's, it was during the height of that opiate epidemic, and so my mom struggled with opiate addiction, and my sister ended up getting removed from the home from DCFS, and so I eventually got removed for a year, and then my mom ended up sobering up a little bit. My sister moved out; she went to college, and then I grew up in Harriman, going to middle school and high school, and it was just me, my mom, and I, and so not a
Mm.
lot of great experiences when I was younger, but as I grew up, I saw my mom kind of progress from having a really big struggle with addiction to overcoming that challenge and coming back to Christ, which is really cool. Grew up with big extended family on both sides. My dad's side has a lot. He had a lot of siblings, a lot of kids. They had a lot of kids, and so same with my mom's side. So it was really cool to have that big family environment. We'd spend a lot of time doing family parties and getting together. So family's a big thing for me. My mom and sister mean the world to me, and as well my immediate family now, my wife, my daughter, and her family. Um, Grew up playing sports. I played baseball growing up. Didn't end up making the high school team just because I didn't grow up playing like super competitive ball. So I kind of switched gears and did rugby, wrestling, and track, and met a lot of really cool people. Got a lot of good experiences that way at Harriman. And then I grew up. I grew up not going to church a lot of times. So I was born LDS, right? Like grew up in the faith and learned about Jesus Christ. But with my mom struggling with addiction and struggling with a hard domestic situation with my dad, My dad was a great guy, but just had a really bad temper. So they had some issues, and so I didn't really go to church growing up until about 13 or 14. I moved in with my 12. I apologize. Moved in with my aunt and uncle, who are salt of the earth people, amazing, amazing people. My aunt and uncle are like a father and mother to me. Helped me go to church a little bit, and then when I moved back to my mom, I didn't really go to church until we moved out of. We lived by the high school. Sorry, kind of going a little ramble here, but we lived by the high school, and then we moved to a place that was a little bit closer to Mountain View. Moved from a different ward. I had a great bishop in that ward, great youth program. Was kind of going periodically to church. Was still struggling with friends and being around influences that didn't really help me live the gospel. Kind of fell into some substance abuse and chastity issues. But once I moved, I had two scout leaders and a bishop who kind of took me under their wing, and it was a really cool opportunity to kind of see that I didn't have to be influenced by my environment. Um, I remember when I first moved there, my scout leaders and all the ward kind of helped me move in, and my scout leader, I love him to this day, he's still like a dad to me. He came over to my house, and I told everyone in the ward, I was like, I'm not going on a mission. I'm going straight in the military. Church is kind of but military is kind of my thing. And he told me, he's like, hey, well, they call me Chase because that's my middle name. My dad's name is Eddy too, so at home I go by Chase. And he's like, Chase, like, if you get your Eagle, you'll get an automatic rank up in the military. And at the time, I'm like, yeah, let's do it. Looking back, I'm like, this guy was trying to get me back to church, which is awesome. Like, he was kind of connecting with me like the Savior would, on a personal level. And I'm extremely grateful that he thought about what was personal to me and finding a way to connect. And so he told me, he's like, give me your blood, sweat, and tears, and let's get your Eagle, and I'll help you get a rank up or two in the military. In which it was definitely a thought in my mind. I was like, I need to get my Eagle, and so I started going to scouts every week, and then he would call me every Sunday. He's like, Chase, why aren't you in priest quorum right now? And I'm like, I'm rather sleepy. He's like, get your shirt and tie on, and get over here. And so every Sunday I'd just come to third hour, and then I started coming to first hour and second hour and third hour. And eventually I started learning about the gospel. He helped me kind of read my scriptures, and not just him, but I had another scout leader who helped me get into wrestling because he wrestled at BYU and helped me learn about the gospel, and he would tutor me. My bishop would help me a lot. And the thing I love about my bishop is he connected with me. He was like the Savior would. He'd meet you where you're at. He'd wear stance socks. I always remember that. And he had a beard. And back then, having a beard as a bishop was kind of like a little taboo. It's like, oh, like you're supposed to be clean shaven. And he's like, nah, man, let your freak flag fly. Like, come as you are. And I remember those three guys and their wives and their families just took me in. Eventually started, reading my scriptures and praying more and going to church, and they just were huge influences in my life. And I developed a testimony, and it was really cool to be able to gain faith in Jesus Christ. And I decided while I was at Trek, or it was youth conference, yeah, decided to go on a mission. And one of the greatest things that's ever happened to me in my life is going on a mission. Went to DC South, had a great experience out there, got to serve with some great people, meet some amazing people, some lifelong friends, and then came back to school at UVU and met my wife at Institute, first day of college, which is awesome. And then got married and been going to school, and then decided to become a police officer just on the spur of it because my wife didn't want to travel with the military. She said, no more military. And I said, okay. So sometimes you got to sacrifice for the family, but it was a really good opportunity. Just been living in Utah County and working in Utah County as an officer since. And so going to UVU, which is a great opportunity. So yeah, it's kind of a little bit about me. Sorry, that was a little deep dive.
No, that was perfect. I have so many questions and so many directions I want to take it in because that was so good. So just kind of to bring it back a little bit, you mentioned your dad passing away from an overdose. You were how
I
old
was
then?
8. Yeah, so I was 8 years old when he died.
8 years old.
Mhm.
Okay. So do you have like a lot of memories of him then?
So it's kind of funny. My sister, she was 12 when he died. She has a lot of memories of him. She knows him, remembers his personality and everything. And I'm the exact opposite. I have like 3 or 4 memories of him, and I can't remember anything before I was like 11 or 12, really, in my childhood, which is kind of weird because I'm like, my wife can tell me that she remembers things when she's like 3 or 2, and I can't remember anything before like 11 or 12. So kind of a big contrast there. I don't know why, but that's just kind of how we grew up.
Yeah. It's interesting. As a therapist, I've studied a lot about like blocked trauma and all that. And like that's one of a defense mechanism that our body and that our mind can have. The interesting thing is like a lot of times we just think of like the mental aspect of like psychology and therapy and all that. But there's a really prominent book that's called The Body Keeps
Mhm.
the Score, right? And so a lot of people that experience like significant trauma early on, like cognitively in their mind, they might not necessarily remember it. The mind might kind of just block that out as a means
Mhm.
to help them just move forward with their life and not stress about it. But, you know, all of a sudden they get entered into a certain situation that might
Mhm.
remind them. You know, it's kind of like a
Totally.
flashback, PTSD,
Yeah.
and all that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden they're like having a panic attack or they're having these sort of symptoms and they're not really sure
Sure.
why because the body remembers it, but the mind is, you know, they've blocked that out and it's tried to move past it. So that's a really interesting aspect of therapy. I don't know if you've ever like experienced something like that
Yeah, no,
where.
that's a good question. So I haven't with like my childhood. I haven't had that, but I recently was required by my department to go to a therapy visit because they're starting to do it annually, which is really good. It's a good progress for police officers.
Mhm.
But she talked about that, like there's things called fragments, and you'll have like a memory that comes up, and you just have to let it pass and deal with it. And I did have that with like a really a critical incident I went on, and it was just a random experience that I had when I was in a pool. It just kind of came back to me because I was holding my nephew and had an incident with a kid that on my job that just was really traumatic. But it hit me while I was holding my nephew and kind of hanging out with my wife and my sister and brother-in-law. And it just was weird to have that memory come up when I hadn't been thinking about that for a year or so. And so yeah, it totally
Mhm.
happens. Like things will trigger those memories that you just don't even think you have. So I totally agree with
Mhm.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. You also mentioned that your mom was kind of struggling with some, substance use and all that. And around what time did she start using? Like, how old were you, and when did she
Great
sober up?
question. Yeah, so I don't remember the time that she started because I think it might have been right around when I was born. I may be wrong. So if my mother sees this episode, please forgive me. No, but I think she started either just right when I was a young kid or before I was born because I think back then they just would allow people to order like controlled substances off the internet because it was so there was not a lot known about it. But so she started using when I was a
Mhm.
young kid, and it just followed her until I was probably 15 or 16 is when she started like really getting on the recovery path. Yeah, and she had some struggles here and there. Don't get me wrong. Like addiction is definitely a long road, and there are setbacks. But she's doing really good now. She meets with therapists and does a lot to kind of keep that under control for my family and my sister's family. But yeah, I think it started when I was really young, and it kind of followed until I was almost an adult.
Mm. Yeah, I just had the chance to talk to her
Yeah,
at Juan's
yeah.
wedding, and she just has such a
Oh,
light
yeah,
about her
yeah. She's
countenance.
amazing.
You can tell that she's an
No, I
incredible
appreciate that.
lady. Um, as someone that's worked a lot with, so I work a lot with court ordered clients who have charges of either domestic violence or
Hmm.
substance abuse. And so we
Yeah.
had a lot of a lot that we talked about when we decided we were going to do
Oh,
this
yeah.
episode. You and I were kind of catching up, and we're like, wow, there's a lot of parallels kind
Absolutely.
of between what we do, and we'll talk more about
Absolutely.
that. But as someone that's worked a lot in substance abuse settings and with addiction recovery, uh, I've developed a lot of compassion and
Hmm.
understanding, and I've also experienced
Right.
addiction myself. Both with substances and
Hmm.
pornography and all these other things. And so um, you know, I have a lot of understanding and a lot of compassion, and certainly no judgment from me, who's experienced it as well. Um, I it's funny, especially in Utah where the church is really
Hmm.
prominent, and obviously we believe in the
Right.
word of wisdom, which we don't use
Right.
substances or alcohol or even
Right. Right.
coffee. Like we have this really, really strict kind of dietary and
Right.
substance code, and so there can be
For
some
sure.
stigma against those who have used substances or use substances. Um, and it can be really
Right.
hard. It can be really hard for those who experience substance abuse because they feel that perceived
Totally.
stigma. They feel that everyone's kind of judging them and shaming them
Totally.
basically. And shame can be like a really big driver of continuing
Totally.
the cycle of abuse. Um, And so there's certainly a lot of compassion there. Have you had the chance to kind of sit down with your mom and kind of talk about her experience with
Yeah,
that?
it's there's been a few opportunities I've had in my life to have conversations with her, and we talk about it even to this day. Um, I love having conversations with her now because I tell her like, I'm grateful that you didn't give up on your life because myself and my wife and my daughter need her. And she's to the point now where she can watch my daughter, and my wife and I trust her. And she hasn't had an episode in a long time, like a relapse episode is what I mean. But it's really cool to have seen her progress, and to really understand where she's come from. I don't think I will ever fully grasp what she's gone through, and that's why I'm grateful for the Savior's atonement and His willingness to suffer that. Because knowing her struggle, it like knowing a slight bit of her struggle helps me understand it, but I don't think I'll ever fully grasp it. Because when I was 8 years old, I saw her as like my mother, right? And I saw her as like the person in the home to keep me safe. But she had recently lost her dad 2 years ago, or 2 years before my dad died, who was like her anchor. Her husband beat her many times, and she struggled with he struggled with infidelity and a lot of things, and she had two kids that needed her. And when he passed away, she had no job experience, no work experience, no college, nothing to do anything to provide for her family. And so seeing the pain that she went through from being a victim herself, having so much responsibility, two lives on top of her, that needed her care constantly, and then seeing her use a crutch such as addiction, it was a vicious cycle to see. But having her overcome that and seeing the mountain that she overcame, because I mean, we all have struggles, right? But I'm very grateful for my mom because she didn't give up. And it could have been easy to give up, could have been easy to continue the cycle, but she fought as much as she could, right? All relative, right? Seeing her effort was tremendously impressive. And it gave me such a love for her and a love for the atonement, because it showed me that no matter your past, no matter what you've gone through, you can overcome it. And she still fights it today, right? Like it's not like it's over, right? She still has what I would say, quote unquote, demons, right? Like she still fights the struggles, the impulses, because addiction is a real thing. But it gives me such a love for her because she's willing to do it for me, for my wife, for my sister, for my brother-in-law, for our kids. And it's just cool to see that she overcame that because she had love for other people.
No, I think the irony in it all is those who might
Yeah,
cast judgment on someone experiencing addiction and substance abuse are the very same people that like they have not had to go
totally,
through anywhere near what
totally,
someone like your mom has
totally.
gone through. And so like it I might sound off for a little bit, but like people in Utah that they grow up in kind of these comfortable, like Utah is like the safest
Yeah,
state like in terms of like
totally,
crime rates and all that, and like it's a great
totally.
place to live. Great, great place to probably
Yeah,
be a police
yeah,
officer, but
absolutely.
you
Still see
still see some
the good
stuff
stuff,
for
right?
sure. But like Utah is a
Totally,
great place to live. It's comfortable. You're kind of separated from a lot of things. Like there's some things going on in like
totally.
California, things going on in Texas,
All of it.
Washington
Yeah,
State that like it's you read the news and you see it and you're like, wow, that's
yeah,
crazy. Like all these things going on. And so I feel like especially here, like United States in general, like we have a very good quality of life, but like especially in Utah, like we're
absolutely.
comfortable. A lot of us are really comfortable. Um, and so it's really hard for us to just
Yeah,
comprehend the struggles of others. And like we really can't stand in a place of
totally.
judgment. Like when I work with my clients in therapy, the oftentimes they'll come in and they'll share some sort of
Hmm.
trauma, like a lot of times with the domestic violence clients it's pointing the finger at their spouse and saying like, before I ever like laid hands on my wife, she verbally abused me for
Hmm.
years, or she put her hands on me but I'm the one with the charges, and so it's kind of like a lot of justifying and a lot of kind of pointing the finger. And so a lot of my work is like getting people to have compassion towards either their partner or their parent or someone that they feel victimized by, and understanding, okay, well, what happened in their life that led to the point that they would treat you
Right.
like that
Yeah, no,
you
and,
know
and I really love what you said there, the compassion, because yeah, in Utah we do have a stigma And I think the stigma can come from ourselves, right? Like I think, well, let me rephrase this. I think the stigma we feel that because Utah is so religious and we have such a prominence of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that a lot of people feel like they're being judged. And there are times where they are judged, right? Like people aren't perfect. There's sometimes a culture, and I feel like sometimes that comes from ourselves too because we think that people are judging us. But I think with addiction and I think with domestic violence, all variety of issues in our homes, in our lives, I think a lot of times we fail as human beings. And I say this for myself. I don't want to speak for everyone, but we fail to see people for who they are, who they truly are, right? Um, for instance, the people that you were dealing with in therapy, a lot of times these people that have struggled with addiction or domestic violence or whatever the issue may be, we forget to see them as Christ would, or we forget to see that they are a child of God. And who on this earth would want to have a life where they're hurting someone else or couldn't live without a substance? These people don't choose to grow up thinking, oh, I'm going to grow up and be a heroin addict or I'm going to grow up and be a meth addict. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
no, it's sometimes these people come across really hard things, right? Like my mom had a husband. She didn't think she thought she could love and confide in this guy. And he wanted to do that, right? Like he joined that marriage, but sometimes your history and your past kind of affect you mentally and it just leads you into making decisions that aren't right. And I think that's where as we as outsiders, right? Like I'll never know the experience of my mom. I'll never know what it's like to be addicted to a substance as hard as she was. But that's where we can really step in and just look at what's brought her to this point and love her relatively for what she has gone through and overcome. Whether it's, she's still in neck deep in the addiction or she's recovered, we can just try and understand who they are because that's the best that we can do, right? Instead of judge and
Mm-hmm.
and cast them away, right? Because these people need us more than what we think they do, right? They need support, they need connection, they need love, and like I love what you said, compassion. That's a really important word.
Mm-hmm. I heard a quote recently that said, children are a product of their environments and adults are a product of their
Yeah,
choices. And I do want to break that
totally.
down a little bit because I think there is a clause there. Oftentimes, I think we're a little more compassionate towards children and teenagers, but as soon as they turn 18 or as soon as they turn 21 or they turn 25 and their prefrontal cortex is fully
Right.
developed or whatever, we flip a switch and then our expectations change and like, all right, you need to get your
Totally.
crap together, you need to stop making bad choices. And I think and that's why we tend to have that
Totally.
judgment towards adults that are maybe making poor
Totally.
choices. It's because we no longer give them the benefit of the doubt. We no longer have that compassion. The thing is that like a lot of adults can still be products of their environments. And there's the saying that knowledge is
Totally.
power, right? And that's why therapy is so important and why I'm always an advocate of therapy because I felt like until I went to therapy and I learned about things that happened in my
Hmm.
childhood that affected the way I was behaving. The first and foremost, the way I was thinking and how the way I was thinking and believing led to my actions and
Totally.
choices. Learning that then gave me
Totally.
power to understand why am I doing this? Okay, well let's change that then, you know. And so knowledge is power. So
Totally.
we need to, we see someone that might be living on the street, might be abusing drugs, right? And we think like, why don't they just get a job, or why
Right.
don't they just, get their act together? A single mom that's struggling with substance abuse, why don't they just get their act together for their kids? Do they not love their kids
Right.
enough? And so we cast the stone at them in judgment, and you have to realize that until someone is given an opportunity to gain knowledge and
Hmm.
resources, like it's going to be very difficult for them to change their actions without
Totally.
knowledge. Right? It's like the saying, you can either give a man a fish or teach a man how to
Absolutely.
fish. Well, it's like you can even teach a man how to fish, but that man might not have a
Right.
fishing
Yeah.
pole.
It doesn't have the ability, the capability.
So that's not going
Yeah.
to help
Yeah.
him, right? So we need to not only give people knowledge, but we also need to give them
Totally.
resources. and enable and empower them to change their lives. And until we do that, we can't be like, look at this bum just sitting on the dock
Yeah.
watching fish,
No,
you know?
absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's a hard thing to think about with people that struggle with addiction, that struggle with their past, right? It reminds me of the parable in the New Testament where the adulteress is brought before Jesus Christ, and they throw her and said, what should we do with her?" kind of thing. And I'm paraphrasing. Obviously, I'm not a scriptorian at my best, but I love what Jesus says. He's like, "You without sin, cast the first stone." Like, you've all got things going on. Like, I have things going on. We all do, right? And so when we see these people on the street, like, we think like, oh, wow, like they're just a burden to society. Like, they're stuck doing this because they chose to do it, right? Like you said, the choices, their decisions brought them to this point. And I think it's partly true. We all have agency, God-given agency, right? But I think that's what Christ tries to teach us. And I struggle with this. I will be completely vulnerable right now. I struggle with this commandment, is to love your enemy, because I've had some experiences where I've shown compassion and I've tried to reach out to these people in my job, right, professionally, and there's been some instances where it's hard to love this person. I'm like, you're doing this to yourself, or you're doing this to someone else, and I know you've made this decision, and I have to enforce a law or a social construct to save someone else or to protect someone else's health, safety, well-being. And it takes me a lot of it takes a lot of willpower and a lot to step back and think, okay, you know what, God told me not to think about them in that way. He told me to love them, and just love them. That's all. Love your neighbor. Love God and love your neighbor. And it's a really hard thing to think about, because you're thinking this person's neglecting their children because they're addicted to opiates, they're addicted to this, they're beating their spouse, and it's like, you know what? Maybe they have some issues in their past that they haven't worked through. And yes, they shouldn't do that, but maybe they didn't have someone like me growing up. I didn't have someone to teach me how to be a man. I didn't have a dad in the home. And so maybe we think, see them for who they are. Maybe they didn't have somebody to help them realize, like, you can have a better life. You can do this. And that may come to them when they're 30, 40, 50. Who knows, right? Everybody has a journey.
And the very reason that someone is able to stand there in judgment looking down on someone that might be in worse circumstances than themselves, it's because that person has probably had access to knowledge and resources
Totally.
that that other person never had, right? And so, you know, that is
Totally.
privilege, right? That is, and so we can never assume that we know the full story and understand, we know the picture, talking about how God feels
Right.
about us,
Right.
like, especially us as members
Right.
of the church, like, we have been given knowledge, we have been
Totally.
given resources, and if we're gonna go then and judge someone else, like,
Who are
no,
we?
like, God has given us so much, right? and and we might even judge someone that's like, oh, well, they're a member of the church, how come they don't go get help, or
Right.
how come they don't. It's like, well, then again, you haven't lived their life, you don't know the full story.
Only
Only
God
God
does.
does. Only God can be the judge. And that's one of my favorite sayings, because I don't know, there's some Christians that say, like, you know, Mormons are going to hell, or, and this might be a little bit off topic, but, or they ask, like, oh, do you guys think that we're going to hell because we have different beliefs? And the first thing I always say is, I'm not the
Nope.
judge.
Not me.
That's not my job to decide who's going
Absolutely.
where. Thankfully
Absolutely.
not, because I would do a
Me
terrible
too.
job at it. None of us are good at interpreting scriptures. None of us
Absolutely.
are good. None of us are good at deciding who goes where. There's only one
Totally.
person, that knows the beginning from the end, that knows our hearts, that's perfectly able to balance the scales of justice and
Totally.
mercy. And so we don't have to, like, so often we try and put ourselves in that
Hmm.
judge seat, you
Totally.
know, and we give our opinion and our 2 cents of on something, and it's like, that's not your
Totally.
job. Your job is to
Totally.
love, right? And so God put us on this earth to be more merciful,
Absolutely.
right? And then he brings in the justice, he brings in the accountability. And that doesn't mean that we're never, obviously in our lives we do have to hold
Absolutely.
boundaries. That's a huge part of your job, is, imposing boundaries and limits, and bringing
Absolutely.
justice, right? But in terms of, like, final judgment about someone's character, or about someone's, who someone is as a person and what they deserve in their life,
Yeah.
like that's not your job,
No,
man.
I am
So
very grateful that that is Heavenly Father's job, and Jesus Christ has stepped in to help us be an advocate because I could not do that. Like I have to do that sometimes as like in a legal sense in my job, but and even at home, right? Like you have to figure out like how to respect boundaries and figure out like how to interpret situations. But man, I am so grateful that we have a perfect being who understands the beginning from the end, like you said, and knows our hearts and loves us perfectly, right? Like it says in the scriptures, like you're not worth the dust of the earth. And obviously I'm not quoting that. I'm paraphrasing, right? I'm not quoting it perfectly, but like for someone who can see something so little and so insignificant, and I don't mean to down or to put anyone down, but and he still loves us and willing to be patient and let us come back to him. It's phenomenal, right? It gives me hope. It gives me hope for people like my mom who may still be in the thick of things. And I think that's what we should think about as members of the faith, right? Like the belief of Jesus Christ, right? Is that we should look at these individuals and trust me, I know it's hard, but look at these people panhandling, look at these people hurting their spouses, or even look at the people. I don't think this gets talked about a lot, but look at the people in the really nice houses. Like I go to houses that are really nice and have multi-million dollar incomes, and they have their struggles. It's all the same, right? We all have our struggles, and so look at them like Christ said, like have that mercy and compassion. I think that's an important thing.
I was thinking about you told your story of kind of starting to go to church kind of when you were 13. And I think of myself when I was 13. Like I grew up in a family with both parents where it was like we go to church. That's what we do. You know, we were there every Sunday. I used to fake being sick so that I could stay home from church and watch football on Sundays. My family was one of those where we weren't allowed to watch
For sure.
football on Sundays. You know, it was like, you're either wearing church clothes after you get home from church or you're in pajamas, and that's the dress code. And you're either like reading scriptures or watching a
For
church
sure.
video. That's the only, you
Right,
can't
right.
watch TV, you can't like entertain yourself with any worldly music or
Mm-hmm.
anything. And I thought that was the normal, and I was kind of shocked when I went to college and like, you guys are playing Smash Bros on Sunday, and so I was kind of judgmental in that way. But yeah, I grew up in kind of that context of like that is what we do. We go to
Right.
church, and so I kind of like
Right.
rebelled against it. And I'm thinking of myself, like if I was, me in my life, if I was 13 going to church for the first time, I would have been like, bro, I could be watching football right now. Like,
Right.
I would be so resistant
Right.
to it. Was that kind of your experience?
Yeah.
And you mentioned some factors that helped you
Yeah.
kind of get into a different place,
Absolutely.
but
No, I was definitely resistant. Don't get me wrong. As a 13, 14-year-old kid going back to church, my mom didn't start going back to church with me until I was about 16. So I was going to Sundays by myself, sitting alone, or my scout leaders would never let me sit alone, but sometimes I would. But yeah, it was hard, dude. It was really hard because to be honest, I grew up in a home where swearing was normal. Like that was a normal thing. My mom had some funny nicknames for me when I was being bad, but that was totally normal. Swearing was normal. Like watching movies, TV on Sundays was totally normal when I was growing up. Going out to eat on Sundays was totally normal. And for those that may not like know of our faith, like we choose to kind of keep the Sabbath day holy, and some people may feel that going out to eat or doing those things on Sundays is something that they withhold from because they want it to not be as a common day. But it's totally personal in between you and Heavenly Father. The norm for me was not to be holy or to be reverent, and so going to church and kind of putting off the natural man was hugely different. I will say this, and this is something that may not be like the social norm in a lot of wards, but my scout leader swore like a sailor, and my bishop, like I said, he had a beard, he wore stance socks, like he was super super casual, and that helped me to kind of meet me where I was at. And I don't think that's something that's talked about a lot in the church. I think a lot of times we look at bishops and look at these leaders, and they should be perfect and they should be very clean and wholesome, and I think that is very important. But the fact that my scout leader would curse a lot brought me back. Like, and I know that sounds contradictory. Don't get me wrong. Like, right, we
yeah,
should have an environment where we invite the spirit.
you're like, he's
Yeah,
one of
literally, I would
me.
look at him
Like,
and I'm like, this guy speaks like I do. He speaks my language, and he's still a faithful member of the church. and he wasn't afraid to call me out, and that was something that I needed, as I needed someone to correct my behavior and to be a man about it, because it was grateful. I was grateful to have that experience where I was able to have someone who loved me enough to help kind of cut me down sometimes. Obviously, the Savior is behind it. He was the one pulling the strings, and Heavenly Father was guiding these people. But having someone that told me like, "Hey, it's okay that you swear. Hey, it's okay that you watched movies until Sunday, until church. Like, it's okay. You're here. That's all that matters. I'm just glad you're here." And when I would show up at scouts with my hair all over the place and not really wanting to be there with a bad attitude because I was, had a rough day with my mom or a rough day at school, they're like, "Hey, man," they take me around the shoulders and tell me, "Hey, it's okay. You're here. That's all that matters." And so having people that could relate with me was super important in that regard. And coming back to church, sorry, it's kind of a roundabout way to get there and kind of going all over the place with topics, but I think that's important when you look at someone from the outside thinking, okay, this individual, he's come in a regular shirt to church, or he's showing interest in growing a faith in Jesus Christ. Like, Jesus Christ would use parables to teach the people, right? He would use parables about fishing, farming. These are the people he was with: farmers, fishermen, lawyers. He would use things that would relate with them. And that was such a powerful thing to me because I was a kid who grew up in a home where you know, the F bomb was normal. Like that was normal for me. And my scout leaders, they talked to me who I was. They talked to me at a level that I can understand. And I thought that was really cool. And so yeah, it was really hard to not rebel and do that. And I had my ups and downs, but I think, like it says in scriptures, I think by small and simple things, great things come to pass. I think it took me years and years of just slow and consistent effort and reading the Book of Mormon eventually and praying on my own to kind of learn that like this is something I wanted. And this is something that really brought my soul back together and helped me really overcome my obstacles in my life. And so it was hard, but once I saw that outcome, looking back, I never want to live a different life because I know who I was before the gospel, and I know what kind of life I was living. And I was a broken kid and a broken man, and I was put back together because of Jesus Christ and His atonement. And I couldn't be more grateful for it.
Yeah. No, I love that. As you were talking, the phrase "meet people where they are," that stuck out to me so much, and that's been something I've been trying to focus on recently. I've talked about this in other episodes, but I am so grateful for the times that I've had away from the church, the times where I was having substance use issues and where I was having chastity issues and
For
walking in
sure.
sin, walking in the world, because that has allowed me to connect and relate to so many people, right? And going back to sometimes a judgmental culture that exists at church,
For sure.
right? Like the thing about Jesus Christ, and I will say this over and over and again, and I've said this in previous episodes. He turns our biggest L's into our biggest W's.
For sure.
Using
I
Gen
love
Z
it.
terminology.
I love it. Speak to the
right?
people.
And so Jesus Christ, because he is so holy, because he is so perfect, and his atonement is so perfect, he uses our sin to bless
For
others
sure.
in a way. He flips it on its head, to where because we've had experience walking in sin and walking in the world, we can then reach outward to others that are doing the same. Like, hey, I'm right there
I'm in the
with you,
trenches.
dude. Like, yeah, I'm in the trenches. Like, I still swear a
Me
lot
too,
to
man.
this day.
I
Like,
gotta work on that. My wife gives me a hard time about that, but I gotta speak the language of the people sometimes.
yeah, yeah. No, for real. I was
Oh
boating
yeah.
yesterday, and when we were on that tube, man, I was
Oh,
letting it fly.
absolutely.
I was letting it fly. Our tube went like 6 feet up in the air and then
Whew.
flipped, and this girl's like entire torso like landed on my
Ooh,
head.
painful.
And there were
Oh
some
yeah,
words.
for sure.
There were some words. I definitely have a headache today, so if I start saying some gibberish or like, just like give me a nonverbal cue or
I'll
something,
give you a signal.
yeah. But yeah, dude, I have my own struggles. I've never
For
claimed to
sure.
be perfect
For
on this
sure.
podcast. Like even yesterday when I was hanging out with my friends, I was saying a lot of like really
For sure.
crude sexual jokes. And for most of the time we were there, people were kind of
For sure.
laughing but it got to a point where somebody like
For
called
sure.
me out on it. And I was like,
Yeah, I
you know
needed
what,
that.
you're right.
I need to correct it,
So,
and that happens, right? We all
yeah.
do. We all have it.
Yeah. It's interesting with this podcast because sometimes I feel like I have to hold myself up to
For
like this
sure.
standard and put myself on this pedestal that like I'm this holy
For sure.
person and that that I'm having this podcast and I'm giving people advice because I have overcome all of that. But I still struggle with a lot of things. I still struggle with language. I still struggle with making crude jokes. I still struggle
Sure.
with lust.
For sure.
It's a
Ongoing
constant
struggle.
battle. And actually having this podcast has been one of the greatest sources of strength in my life
Totally.
to continue to have a reason to
Totally.
fight. It is an ongoing battle, and I don't claim to be. I think a lot of times, especially with like pornography in the church, like we've become more open and willing to talk about it, but it's like from a point to, oh, I used to struggle
Right.
with that. That's something I used to do before my mission, or oh, it's something I used to struggle with, but now I'm a year
For sure.
clean and it's whatever. And for someone to say, oh, I'm still struggling with it, like I'm
For
still
sure.
battling that, then people are like, oh. So we've gotten to the point to where before it was like, if you've ever seen porn in your life, then you're
Yeah.
bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, we've gone on, we've
Totally.
graduated from that
Yeah.
as a culture. I feel like, and now we're willing to talk about it a little bit more, but more in the past tense. Whereas I want to get to the point where it's like, yo, I watched this
Yeah.
morning or I watched yesterday and I need
Totally.
support and I need that kind of stuff to where someone can say that and there can be acceptance and there can be love rather than, dude, you're still struggling with
Right.
that. Like,
Right. They're
really?
casting stones, right? You're like, we're all struggling.
It's like, you're Sunday school teacher. You should
Right.
be better,
Totally. Yeah. No.
So, no, I think there's a lot of power in and just being honest and vulnerable and saying like, yo, I still
Totally.
struggle with things. Like I'm not a saint. All of us are
Totally.
sinners. I am a
Totally.
sinner, dude. Like and Jesus Christ has changed my life because he has told me like it's never
For
been
sure.
about you in
Right.
the first place.
Right. Totally.
Like, that's the whole message I'm trying to
Look
send
outward,
you.
man.
It's like you need to rely
Yeah.
on me, continually because I know like me and of my own accord, the place I would be
Me too,
without
man. Oh,
without
absolutely.
Christ, man, I'd be a totally different person. And even with Christ in my life, even with doing all this in the podcast, I still do and say things on a regular basis that I know like that's not
Totally.
who I am. And that's not who I'm
Totally.
trying to be. That's not who Christ has called me
Totally.
to be. And so I continually rely on him, and he continually forgives me
Absolutely.
and gives me that grace. And so I think there's something really
I
powerful in that,
completely agree.
man.
That's one of my favorite scriptures in the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon being another volume of scripture that we read in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I love the Book of Mormon. I remember one of the things that brought me back as a youth was reading Alma 36, and I'm grateful that Come Follow Me this last week that we've been reading Alma 36 because that was by far one of my favorite volumes of scripture in the Book of Mormon is Alma the Younger's experience. But when you were saying that about talking about how we continue to make mistakes and talk about the present tense because I think that's so important, right? Like, yeah, we've had struggles, but we have struggles now. Like, we have struggles now. Um, Seeing Alma's experience and then seeing King Benjamin talk about how we need to put off the natural man and become a saint through the atonement of Jesus Christ. I think that's some powerful verbiage, right? That we have to utilize Jesus Christ and his atonement. It's through him. So I think that's super powerful.
I love that, man. I do kind of want to transition and talk a little bit about like you and
For
Swan. We
sure.
talked a little bit about this about
Yeah, yeah.
outside of the podcast and how you guys kind of come from a very different family
Yeah.
dynamic, a very different family culture, and then how it's been in your guys' marriage and kind of
For
coming
sure.
together and kind of, synthesizing different
Yeah.
things and creating your own
Yeah,
family
no, I
culture.
love the you talked about synthesizing and creating. Um, there's a phrase, sorry, this is kind of going back to the other conversation, but I promise it'll connect. There's a phrase that kind of helped me get through my childhood that's helped me as an adult. And it's so cheesy. Don't get me wrong. Like, you're going to hear it and you're going to think, wow, this guy's a goober. But growing up, this kind of helped me. And I always say, and this is kind of paraphrasing, but I would say, don't let your circumstances dictate or determine your outcome. And like obviously that's like a coin phrase you put on a shirt, right? But like
I don't see how that's
for me in
cheesy.
my head, I'm like, oh, are you some David Goggins or like? I always joke with myself,
Yeah.
um,
But I just heard that.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
like,
yeah,
yeah.
right, right. I would tell myself that as a kid. I'm like, don't let your circumstances determine your outcome, good or bad, right? And coming from like a crappy childhood, like don't get me wrong, other people have harder struggles than I do, but it's part of like who I am, right? It makes me who I am. My wife grew up in the Church of Jesus Christ. Her brother went on a mission. Her dad went on a mission. Her mom was a convert. Mom and dad were super faithful in the gospel. He served in callings. They paid their tithing. They lived the commandments, right? And she learned about the gospel, but she'll even tell you to this day, and I don't say this without without her knowing I would, but she grew up, would go to church, but their family would go out to eat on Sundays, or they would like they were kind of casual, and they were super faithful, but they like the gospel was just something they did socially, lived the gospel, and she'd even admit before we got married she hadn't really read the Book of Mormon or read scriptures. She just went to church. She did choose for herself to go to church. Her mom went through an episode of having heart attacks, open heart surgery, and she had to choose to be faithful, and she continued to live. But she started from humble beginnings spiritually. Her life, though, she didn't really have a lot of struggles growing up. Her mom later in life had some heart surgeries, and they thought they were going to lose her for a bit. But growing up, she had a loving father, loving mother, brother, great family relationships. Would have family home evening, good family. Um, and that was contrasted by me, where I was taken out of the home. My dad beat my mom. I have vivid memories of my dad and my mom physically fighting, and my mom being completely pilled out. Pilled out meaning she was taking a lot of substances, driving me around, passed out, drunk, or pilled out. She's overcome that, and again, I'm grateful for her. But seeing those contrasts and coming together, my wife had a really hard time understanding me because she didn't realize like having a normal life at home and not having arguments in the house was something that wasn't normal. Like when we got married, for her, me seeing each other and living and for her things that were really a big deal, right? Like the dishes weren't done right or I didn't put them away right. For me, I was like, hey, we're not throwing the dishes at each other. We're not like punching holes in the wall. Like we're good. And for her, that's like, no, that's not right. And so it was cool to see that like her experience and my experience could build off each other. Me personally, I'd been reading my scriptures every day. I'd come back from my mission. I was very motivated to keep living the gospel. And her, she started to learn her journey with Jesus Christ. And it's been really an awesome opportunity to see her grow and develop spiritually. Um, I've been able to help her kind of learn a little bit about Jesus. She's obviously done it herself. Her agency, her decision to learn about Jesus Christ, her willingness to put the work in has brought her to where she is. She reads the scriptures every day, does her things, and I don't say that to gloat, but like I'm very proud of her for what she's done, and she's done it on her own. And so we've kind of seen what a traumatic childhood looks like, a normal childhood, and we've kind of been able to build what we want. We take the fact that we don't want what I had, but we want to learn the lessons that I had and bring that into our family. And same for her. There's good and bad from her childhood that we bring together for our daughter, Chantilly. Um, it's been a really neat thing. I'm kind of going on a rant. I apologize, but
Hmm.
the word that you said earlier was synthesize and create. I love the word create because that gives us agency. Obviously, we're giving a godly ability to create and procreate, but it's our opportunity to create the environment we want. And so, because of my background, I don't have to allow that to affect my life. I can choose to have a happy, safe home life that has the spirit if I'm worthy of it, and my wife and I can build that for our daughter, for ourselves. We can have a sanctuary in our home, like President Nelson talks about, and we can do things that can invite that. And so, I love the phrase "Don't let your circumstances dictate your outcome" because it can help you realize that like just because I've had a tattered past doesn't mean I can't have a beautiful future, right?
Yeah. Oh. And it's funny you even described Swan's childhood as a normal,
Yeah, quote
quote
unquote,
unquote
right?
normal childhood, and what even is
Right.
normal? It's like our
Totally.
perceptions of what is normal, right? It's kind of funny because there are a lot of people that experience,
Totally.
traumatic childhoods, right? And I think your experience has helped you lean into that and help
Right.
people, you know, really really powerful. You talked about like creating that sanctuary of a home, um, with your job. We'll
Please.
kind of get into that now. How do you feel like you've been able to kind of compartmentalize different things? Because as someone who's worked
Yeah.
in a lot of stressful environments myself, I really sucked at not taking things
For
home to my
sure.
roommates. I can't even imagine like with my own
Right.
family, wife
Right.
and kid. So what are some practices
For
that
sure.
you've tried to
For
implement that
sure.
in your
No,
life?
I am grateful you asked that. My job is super fun, like super rewarding. Like there's some high speed stuff to it, right? Like it's really fun, it's really cool. But I don't think we talk about the, like you said, how do we compartmentalize the trauma? There is a lot of ugly things in the world that we see, and I don't say that like I don't want to say that like the world is an ugly place. We just see a concentrated dose of it, right? And Swan, she studied at UVU, and her major was family science. And family science is kind of similar to therapy in a lot of ways. And I remember she went to a class, I can't remember, I think it was a social working class or something. And she told me of a story that she learned in that class of a therapist who would deal with a lot of heavy things and really struggle. And eventually he started to adopt this habit where he would walk to a tree at his house. I don't know if you've heard this story, but there was a tree in his front yard, and every time he would go to work or come home from work, he would touch that tree. She's, I'm going to leave all the burdens of everyone that I've talked to, and I'm going to leave everything behind at this tree. And he'd go in home, and he would just think, oh, yeah, now I'm home. I'm here. I'm present. I'm in the moment. I'm Eddy. I get to be joyful Eddy, who's just silly laughs. Like I don't have to be the cop. I don't have to be this guy. And then when he would go to work, he would touch the tree. And he said, okay, I'm taking on that burden. I'm putting the yoke on my back, and I'm going to be therapist, or for my case, cop Eddy. I try and do that. I'm never going to say I'm perfect. Like there are plenty of times where I've come home and I'm like, babes, I had this or I had that, or oh, work or drama, or like I'm sick of people and I'm jaded. Um, there are a lot of struggles with the job, and so I try and keep it away from my wife as much as I can. And she's talked to me. She's like, "Oh, should I become a nurse or should I do this job at UVU that deals with some of the things that cops deal with, or a social worker?" And I'm like, "No, no, no. We need someone in the house that's going to be light and fun and like can bring me back in." And that's just our personal life. Like, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of successful members of the church that have two hard jobs. Um, but I don't know, man. There's a lot of bumps in the road, and there's a lot of learning how to work with you and your spouse. And I think that comes through prayer. I think it comes through having open conversations, because there have been times where I've had to talk to her, and she's been my therapist, and I can't always rely on my wife to be my therapist because she's not trained and that's not her job. But for instance, like I've had experiences where I've seen a bunch of dead kids. Like I've had to do CPR on kids that have died, and I hate talking about that, but it's such a traumatic thing in your head. Like in the moment, you're like, "Okay, I've done this a million times on people, elderly, young, whatever age," and it's hard. It's really hard to come back and think like, "Wow, like that person's no longer here," and it's really sad. I've had instances where I've had to carry people that have been shot and died in my arms, and you don't deal with that as a normal human being. And so like figuring out how to rectify that, or I guess consolidate. Yeah, because and in my head I'm like, I have to do something to protect someone else, right? Like I have to make a decision based on what they're doing. I had no factor to play in this. Like they're making a choice themselves, and their consequences could hurt and harm other people. And so I have to be the one that intervenes. And I won't go into detail there because I don't want to make this so dark where it's like, but um,
Mm.
it weighs a lot. And there have been many days where I've come home and, as a man, you're not like, you don't talk about it. You're like, oh, I don't cry. Like, I'm tough. Like, I'm the guy. I have to be the guy on scene that's like stalwart. But like, you walk into homes and these people are bawling and they just want someone. And you're like, how do I even comprehend that your daughter just died? Or I have to tell you that, like, yeah, your son's not coming home tonight. And it's just like, man, like, how do I not bring that home even? Because I'm like, I can't talk to my coworkers. We're a lot better now, trust me. Like how you've mentioned earlier, how the present tense, like we're a lot better in the police force, but there's such a burden, and this is with a lot of jobs. Don't get me wrong, not just being a cop, but there's such a burden with people that we think that we can't talk to our spouses, we can't talk to other people, and sometimes it leaks out, and you just kind of explode. And so having good healthy habits, eating healthy, working out, reading your scriptures, going to church, praying, um, exercising, those things really help keep you grounded. And so I don't know if I'm the best at it because I talk to my spouse all the time, and I like to talk because that's how I grew up coping in my house. But keeping a cheerful attitude and trying to remember, like, leave work at work, touch the tree, and then when I go to work, touch the tree again and bring work into it. Like be the one you need to be. It's kind of a long
Yeah.
response.
No, I love the story of the tree. That was cool. I hadn't heard that before. I almost laughed when you first said it, like leaving the burden on the tree. I was like, imagine you walk outside and the tree's just like dead. It's just like, yeah. You're like, oh no.
Probably get a new tree.
Yeah. But I love that. I started when I was working at a residential treatment center for troubled teenagers. I started this practice of every time I'd get in my car, whether I had parked my car and I was ready to head into work, or I had just gotten in my car to go home, like I would do some
Right.
breath work. I'd do some meditation, and I'd pray as well, just as like a way to transition
sure.
my day. And we need to, our body needs to know, like our mind needs to be able to communicate to our body, like we're leaving this situation for another one, because the way that our bodies work is, our autonomic nervous systems, right? They, in high pressure, in stressful situations, we go into
Right.
fight or flight, right? We get that arousal. We get that, our blood is pumping, adrenaline, cortisol, all this kind of stuff is going through our bodies. And it's our bodies often still think, even when we're in calm situations, that we're still in that, right? And that's why soldiers with PTSD, they come home from deployment, and in their body they're still in the battlefield,
Totally.
right? And so they hear a firework and they're like slamming themselves closed in their closet crying, because they're convinced that they're still in the battlefield where they watched their friend die, that kind of stuff. And so it's really important to communicate to your body, like, you're safe, like you're no longer in that high situation where all that stuff was needed, that adrenaline, that cortisol, all that stuff. Now you can relax, and you're going into a safe home environment, right? And so that's been really big for me in terms of like leaving our burden on the tree. I thought that was a really powerful metaphor for Christ.
Absolutely.
Like for me, I'm not like a licensed therapist yet. I'm just an internship, and I don't have a family yet. That's definitely something that I'm working towards.
We're all getting
trying to get there. Yeah, but having a wife and kids, like that's one of my biggest goals. And when I am going to my own practice, hopefully someday in the future, I want to be able to pray, say, Jesus Christ, like, put the burden on me. Let me be the mantle for this person's pain. Let me absorb it and empathize and feel it, and not run from it. And then when I go back home, all right, Christ, I need you to take this, because I don't need it anymore. Like, I'm going home to my family. I can't take that person's pain that I took upon me earlier. So I need you to take this. I love that analogy. I think that, wow, that just gave me so much help for my future career.
Grateful
so
for
cool.
someone to tell me that, and the teacher to teach that. And it's Christ does that for us, and it's really cool. I love that you talked about him having the mantle and you being an instrument. That's cool.
No, I also did want to talk a little bit about like secondary trauma, and another term for this is like compassion fatigue, which is something that's like very common among therapists, is compassion fatigue. It's, you're constantly learning about other people's hardships, other people's trials, and the burnout, the emotional burnout that can come from it. And on top of that, you also have, burnout is a part of most jobs, most professions, but police officers in particular, you kind of have like an unpredictable schedule. You were kind of telling me when we were trying to plan out this podcast that like you don't really know your schedule
idea what I'm
until
doing.
Mondays, or
So my schedule, like my work schedule, it's consistent in a way. Like we rotate every 5 weeks. I go days and nights, and then like this week I worked Wednesday, Thursday. Next week I don't work Wednesday, Thursday. I work every other day. So it's kind of weird. But like my day-to-day schedule, I have no idea what I'm doing. Like I've gone on cases where I'm fighting someone in their car because they're intoxicated or under the influence of drugs, to helping someone figure out how to work with their ex-spouse on custody stuff, to a car accident where someone could have died. And so I have no idea. Or it could just be me sitting and running traffic. Like,
getting the cat
literally,
out of a tree,
like I
or
could be
something.
running up and getting a cat out of a tree, or like some elderly woman hurt her window in the wind and things, and so she wants me to look in her basement. It could be anything. And so my day to day is very unpredictable. Totally true.
Yeah. There could be a lot of situations where, that fight or flight
No, for
isn't
sure.
needed. And so, but you're always kind of on edge because you don't really know what to
Yeah.
expect.
No, it's
Right.
it's crazy, man. You never truly know what's gonna happen in a situation. Like we will get adrenaline spike, or I guess a cortisol spike would be a better way to say it. I don't know the medical terminology, but we get spikes. A lot of times people have like your fight or flight. We call it like there's a spectrum. I think it's the Cooper scale. I can't remember what it is exactly, so don't quote me. But there's like you're in the white where you're at home on the couch watching TV. There's yellow where you're kind of tense. Orange where you're like, oh man, like I really need to keep my head over my shoulder. I might like it's fight or flight almost. Red where you're like, I could die. Like this is really like adrenaline spike. And then black where you're like you're so gone that you can't keep focus. Like all of your extremities can't really work. Like you're so mentally gone. And a lot of people live in the white, right? Sometimes they go in the yellow, but most of the time, a normal day to day person's in the white for stress levels. But a police officer, we live in the yellow, we're in the orange and red a lot, and sometimes we go to the black. And I remember, sorry, I'm kind of going deep on this mental thing, but I remember when I went to my second week of work, like I was right out of the academy, or still in the academy, but I was on my second week of work. We had a pretty traumatic call, murder suicide. I was first on scene for it. It was a 17-year-old girl and her 19-year-old boyfriend. Boyfriend killed her and then killed himself. Um, and I remember getting the call, and the the call came out, and we're like, oh, this sounds like it's fake. Like we get 49 calls that where these kind of calls come in, and it's always like teenagers making something up or it's not accurate. And this was the 1 out of 50 that was real. And I remember I won't go into too much detail just for respect for the family, but and it's pretty traumatic, so I don't want to bring the mood down. But you go up there, we find them, parents come, and I remember seeing the parents come together. The dad telling the mom the daughter's not coming home and she's dead, and I just remember like on scene, I was in code black, like I had just called the time of death for the boy and saw a lot of gory stuff, and I remember just crying right there, and I was just like, man, like they're not gonna have their daughter. And I remember for weeks, like I just remember the mom and dad screaming, and I remember hearing like the struggle of that and feeling that like, man, they don't have a family member. I wasn't involved. I didn't know who they were. I had no idea this family, who they were, what they did. I had no idea who this kid was. But for weeks and weeks, even to this day, like it still kind of bugs me and messes with me sometimes because I'm like I don't know who these people are, but I felt their pain and I still feel their pain. And professionally, like an accountant can go to his job and like maybe he has a bad audit or whatever they do, and it's frustrating for that day, and then they're done. But for me, it's like years later, and I still remember those things, and I'm like, it's never gonna go away. I don't know. That secondary trauma is totally a real thing. Like you can't just get rid of it.
Yeah. And that's not even secondary trauma at that point. That's primary.
Yeah.
That's but as I was thinking about, that is a horrific event that you experienced firsthand in your life. But the fact that you were able to literally mourn with
Right.
those that mourn, like despite all the kind of the horror of the situation, like there is beauty in the fact that you were able to feel that. Like it makes me think of the Bible verse,
Right.
Jesus
Totally.
wept. And I like how The Chosen depicts, Jesus weeping when he's at Lazarus's tomb. All of a sudden he just breaks down. All of a sudden
Crying.
it's just like,
Yeah.
and it kind of shows like his mental frame, like how he kind of like had this kind of panic
Right.
attack and then just breaks down all of a sudden. Really getting pushed to your edge
Yeah.
like that, being in a situation like, despite how horrific that is, that there's beauty in being able to feel that and being able to take that on, that because you are walking in the footsteps of the Savior.
Yeah. I'm fortunate in that way that I've been given the opportunity to be there, but the Savior does the work, right? I'm just his instrument.
Yeah.
Totally agree with you.
Yeah. I think especially we were talking about kind of like masculinity a little bit, and how a lot of times as men we just push things
bottle it
down. We just, we got to bottle up that emotion. We need to be rational and logical, especially in high pressure situations when you need to respond to something like that. It's like, I don't have time for emotion. Like I need to just be completely rational and logical, and I need to take decisive action.
Can't hesitate.
Right. And so I think a lot of maybe police officers that I've talked to in the past, that like over the years, they become kind of emotionally numb
Yes,
to certain
absolutely.
things. They become kind of
Completely agree.
jaded in certain ways as like a defense mechanism. It's like I can't allow myself to feel these things because it's going to affect my job
Totally.
performance. And um,
Can I say something real quick? I apologize. Don't mean to
no, go
interrupt you.
ahead.
No, I love you said emotionally numb. I was wanting to talk about this concept today, but I'm really grateful that you brought it up because that's been a big struggle in my marriage. Um, and I don't say that like to voice my dirty laundry, right? But like to be a little vulnerable, like my wife needs emotional connection just like any wife would, right? Like any spouse needs like that emotional connection. Like, how was your day? Like, allow me to hear about what's going on. And for my wife, I share this because we've had this conversation before, but like she'll come home and be like, yeah, she's an advisor at UVU, so she helps people with their like graduation track. And she's like, yeah, I had this student that was really rude. And in my head, I'm like, you had someone that was rude to you? Like I had someone that fought with me and spit on me, and I had to like do CPR on a kid until I had to tell the parent that they weren't coming back. And I'm like, that's nothing. Like I don't like, and totally wrong of me, completely wrong, not empathetic. Like her struggles are real and valid, mine are real and valid, equal, different for sure. But like I'll come home and some days she'll tell me something and she's like, why aren't you like, why does this not like, why aren't you saying anything? Like, why does this not make sense to you? Like, why do you seem like you don't care? And in my head, like you said, I'm emotionally numb. Like I'm jaded. Like I'll come home and be like who cares? Like someone left their car on the driveway or they parked somewhere wrong or something like something minuscule. I'll look at it and be like whatever. And my wife's like, why don't you care? And I'm like, I can't. Like I can't take like I go to work and all I do is take people's problems and that's like what I do. And you feel that way, I'm sure, as a therapist. Like you have to take emotional burden and it totally bleeds into your family life. Like I hope and pray that some people on this like podcast that listen have jobs like us because it's normal. It's normal to be emotionally numb. It's hard. I have to check myself all the time because I'll be jaded and I'll be like, I'll say things. My wife will correct me all the time, and I'm gonna say something. I had a day where I had multiple arguments with people. I had to fight. I literally fought like physically fought people, and they were refusing to get out of the car, and they were reaching and doing all sorts of things that caused us officer safety issues. I hate talking about this because I don't give enough context for people to understand, but it was a situation that his actions dictated that. And I had later had a lady that we've dealt with multiple times, and we got a call that she was thinking about harming herself. And I went in there and she screamed at me and she refused. She slammed the door on me and was just being saying such negative things to me. I had already had a crappy day. Like had argued and fought with multiple people, and it just was one of those days where you're just having those things. And I told my wife later, I was like, yeah, you know what? Like, hopefully she does. Like, hopefully she does harm herself. And my wife immediately cracked at me. She's like, don't you say that. That is not okay. And my coworkers and I were always like, oh yeah, problem solved. Like, we don't have to deal with it anymore. And you look from an outside perspective, and I hope people please don't cast your judgment on me because it's hard to understand like where I'm coming from as an officer or a therapist or someone. But like, I share this in complete vulnerability because you get so desensitized to death, to fighting, to whatever it may be, that you just start to lose sight of what's right. And my wife checked me that day. She's like, don't you ever think that. Like, that's not okay. And having someone to do that for you is incredibly valuable. And I love her for it because I was like, you're right. Like, that's not okay. And I am jaded. I'm emotionally numb because that's a human being. That is a child of God. And I don't know their struggles. I don't know what they've gone through, but I need to love them like Christ would. And I've allowed all of this frustration and things to build up in my mind that I thought differently. And I'm like, that's not right. That's not what Christ would want. And it's something that I have to battle even to this day. And that was kind of a longer rant than I wanted to kind of get out and maybe not as like polished as some people think because it may sound really crass, but it's like that's the truth. Sometimes you're just like I have so much rage and pain that I'm just like expressing that, and it's not right.
No, I'm really glad you shared that perspective because we live in a society where there's a lot of judgment against
Right.
police officers.
Right.
Specifically, there's been a lot of, political issues, there's been a lot of racial issues, and there's a lot of stigma against police officers. And I think just sitting down and hearing someone's perspective and story on something like hey, like if you were in their shoes, like what
Right.
would you do? You know, that sort of thing. And you know, that's not to say that every police officer
Totally.
is perfect.
Totally.
You know, there might be some that have, you know, I met some police officers that were kind of racist on my mission in the
Totally.
South, you know, and you know, you got to take everyone individual by individual, but it is a difficult profession. There's a lot of different
Yeah.
factors, right? And you don't know, so like you really don't know the whole situation. You really can't cast
Right.
judgment on it, you know. And so a lot of different directions I want to take that in. But the story that you shared reminded me of I was reading this talk by Elder Robbins. He's a former 70, and he was talking about this one lady who had experienced a lot of abuse from her husband, and he had abused her emotionally, physically, and cause he had been unfaithful to her and used pornography and lied about it, and just really kind of destroyed their marriage, and really kind of destroyed her her mental state and caused her so much pain and grief over this time. And so they ended up divorcing, and she ended up remarrying and kind of restarting this, you know, happy family with another person. And her ex-husband called her, and he told her like all these things of like how miserable he was and how much he hated his life and that he wanted to take his own life. And she said, in that moment, I was going to tell him, well, why don't you
Right.
just do it and do us
Right.
all a favor, you know? Good riddance,
Right.
basically. And the spirit stopped her and said, he is still my child,
Absolutely.
you know? Despite whatever he has done, he is still a child of God. Are you really going to tell? Gosh, man,
Ah, give
I
me
might get
goosebumps.
a little emotional, man. But like, are you really going to tell like a child of God that like he needs to end his
Right.
own life? And that just like completely humbled her and changed her perspective. And in that moment, she flipped and she changed to where she like empathized with
Right.
him and was able to
Right.
care for him emotionally, even though it, it shouldn't have been her
Totally.
responsibility
Totally.
to do that in the first place, but she was willing to
Totally.
do that, you know. So a really cool a really
Appreciate you
cool
sharing that
story.
because it kind of makes me feel a little bit better because I'm like, I just said like, oh yeah, I wish someone hurts themselves, and I'm like, no, like that's not at all, and I'm like,
Like you're
God, I'm
not
grateful for
alone
that because
in that. Like you're
oh
not the only
yeah, and
person that has kind of had that, you know, that way of
totally,
thinking. Um, you know, I think a lot of people can kind
totally,
of we hear that a lot on the news, like, oh,
right,
good riddance, you know, or,
right,
oh, you know, so a lot of people can have that
totally.
mindset. I was kind of wondering, and you're probably still
Sure.
figuring this out, but do you find that there's a lot of things that maybe you don't share with Swan, like when you go home?
Try not
Or
to.
like, have you been able to find like the
Yeah,
balance
that's a
and
good question. Like, yeah, my
all that?
recent therapy visit, she talked about like you need to start asking your spouse like on a level of 1 to 10, like what details do you want to hear about my day? Because she's like you should be able to talk to her because she is your lifeline, but you don't want to burn your lifeline either. Because if I keep giving her tens, it's like she's gonna get traumatized from my trauma. And
Yeah,
yeah, exactly,
secondhand
secondhand
trauma,
trauma.
right? Yeah.
And there's been a few times where I've had to come home late because of something really bad, and I'll just text her and I'm like, hey, like I'm gonna be late. I'm safe. I love you. I'm in something really bad. I'm gonna be late. And we'll get home later and she'll be like, can you tell me what happened? And I'm like, how much do you want to know? And she'll tell me either like a 3, a 5, or a 10. We've started to implement this more now, but back in the day, it was just like, how much do you want to know? Like I didn't use the scale, the 1 to 10 yet, but um, yeah, there are times where I've tried to hold back, and then there are times where I just let her know everything. Like my first critical incident, that one that I talked about with the murder suicide, I just told her everything because I went code black during that, and it just traumatized the heck out of me. Um, but then I've had a few experiences since then, other homicides or things that have caused issues for me. Um, and I'll just tell her, I'm like, hey, this is what happened today. Do you want to know what happened? And she'll kind of let me know where she's at so that I don't cause her harm. But then it allows me an opportunity to speak with her. And so we're fortunate the company that I work at to have like therapists come and do a debrief with everyone, and so then I can hash out the details and kind of cry if I need to cry or talk to people if I need to talk to them. So I don't have to do that for Swan. But yeah, there are definitely things that I try and hold back, and then there are things that I'm just like, you know what, I have to talk about this, otherwise it's gonna eat me and you alive because I'm gonna not be who I need to be. So it's a delicate balance, I guess, to answer your question.
Yeah, and I'm sure you guys are still figuring things
It's a
out,
work in
and that's okay.
progress.
Yeah,
I'm only
it
2
is
years
a
in,
work in progress.
so
Yeah. Well, I just imagine like the amount of emotional intelligence and maturity that you guys are developing
oh
because
yeah,
of that. Like I was saying earlier, like Jesus Christ turns our biggest L's
I
into
love
our
that
biggest
phrase.
W's. Like someone might look at you guys both have stressful jobs and like, where you have to deal with a lot of issues and problems, and um someone might say, "Oh, that's grounds for like a really problematic marriage." Like that's going to create a lot of, but I've been around you and Swan, and you guys have a
Thank
beautiful
you.
relationship, and I think your guys' relationship has become deeper, during your
For
time
sure.
together because it's had
Yeah.
to. It's had
Yeah.
to evolve. It's, pressure either makes coal or diamonds, and I think in your guys' case, it's creating
hmm
diamonds, and um, you guys are able to use these really difficult
Yeah.
situations that are, difficult dynamics, difficult to navigate, like
hmm
communication and like emotional needs and all that, but it's building the foundation for really solid marriage and relationship, and I think that's
Thank you. I
beautiful,
appreciate that,
man.
man. Yeah, it's we're very grateful for what we have. The Lord's given us a lot, so just grateful for it.
Yeah,
You know how that goes.
absolutely. Yeah. Returning kind of to what I was saying earlier, and kind of turning now into the whole theme of the podcast,
Sure.
turn outward, right? You know, um, like I was saying, there is like a lot of stigma against like
Sure.
police
Sure.
officers and themselves, and so there's the phrase like "be the
Sure.
difference you want to
Yeah,
see in the
totally.
world," and all that. And so, how do you kind of balance knowing that there are going to be some people that just don't like you because you are a cop?
Yeah, that's a really hard thing for me personally, and I'm still learning how to overcome that. Because a lot of jobs, like you can just turn it off, right? Like you can close the door on it, and like I'm done. Like, for instance, if I was a plumber, I go to work, I do my job, and then I come home, and people may ask me like, "Hey, like plumbing question," but then it's kind of that. I go home as a cop, and I don't like to. I hate to identify as a cop. Like when people are like, "You're a cop," I'm like, "No, I'm Eddy Saunders. I work professionally as a police officer, 9 to 5, but I'm Eddy Saunders. Like that's who I am." Um, but I guess to go back to your question with like the stigma and to be the difference in the world, and how do I kind of balance that? Um, a lot of times I try and treat people the same either way. I would try to treat them as Christ would, but if I were to tell people that at work, I would say I treat the drug dealer the same as the soccer mom. Like I treat people as equals. Um, there are times and places where I'm going to have to use a big boy voice. Um, I remember some advice I got is that I have to speak the language of the people. Sometimes the soccer mom needs to be talked to differently than the drug dealer, right? Like it's all times and seasons. Whether it's good or bad. Sometimes I have to be really firm with the soccer mom, and sometimes I have to be really nice to the drug dealer, vice versa. But I treat them the same because we're all God's children, in my view. And then professionally, we're all equal citizens in this country, right? Um, but I've had a few interactions with police officers, and they've all been really good. And there have been times where I've been taken out of the home from cops because my life situation has been tough as a kid. Um, and I've been in those same shoes, and I always like to treat people how I would want to be treated. And they talked about that a lot in the academy is be the police officer that you would want responding to your home. Like make sure that you're doing what you should be doing, that you're looking at every perspective and treating people with respect, dignity, and kindness. Even when you have to be firm, right? Like I've had many times where I've gotten in screaming matches with people and had to tackle them and wrestle with them to the ground and used force. And then afterwards, we talk like we're friends. Like I've remembered many instances where I've had to go in homes and I've been thrown into entertainment centers. I've been thrown into walls. They've thrown punches. Like there's, I hate to say these things without giving context because people are like, oh, do you beat people up? I'm like, no, no, no. Like we just had to use force to apprehend a suspect. But afterwards, when I'm at the hospital and he's getting stitched up or whatever, we're getting looked at to take care of it. We talk man to man.
And that's the
No,
part
no,
people
no one
don't
sees
see.
that, and that's
They,
water.
there's someone standing on the sidewalk recording, like, oh, look at
Yeah,
this police officer beating this
and
dude up.
and then we get done,
You
and I'm like,
know,
hey man, water under the bridge. Like we're cool, and they apologize, and I get to know them. I've literally had I had a Polynesian guy who I had to run into the kitchen by myself. No, was this kid? No, it's a different one. Sorry, that was another incident. I had a Polynesian guy, family screaming. They're calling the police saying he's saying suicide by cop. Like he's got guns. He's been screaming and fighting his family. And I come to the apartment complex. Kids are running out, screaming. Dad's in the house, and I'm running in there like, okay, this might be it. And we got in a fight. He threw me into the wall. We fought to the ground. And then once we get him away for his family, he's like, dude, I'm so sorry. And he apologized, and he told me he was going to cook me a pig. And we became best buddies. Like the whole way to the hospital, he was extremely drunk. I met him again another couple weeks later, the nicest guy. Like he had a substance that was introduced into his body that caused him to be a different person. When I met him when he was sober, couldn't have been nicer. And so you have to really level with people and realize that like you're coming in on their worst day. Yeah, society looks at us and they're like, oh, you hate people. You're here to take away my rights. You're here to take my dad or mom or cause harm to my family. And I'm like, no, I have to sit here and think like I am making choices based on other people's actions. So I usually am behind the curve. Like they have made a choice that has brought a consequence, and I am society's choice to enforce the consequence, whether good or bad. And yes, they hate me. I drive around in my town and sometimes I get flipped off. Sometimes people record me and they don't want to talk to me or they spit, throw things at me. You know, they say stupid things and it sucks. And I see all the YouTube videos, don't get me wrong, and everybody wants to talk to me about this cop did this cop did that, this cop did this. And it's like I never get away from it. But like I have to think like this is my opportunity as a citizen, but also as a disciple of Christ to help people recognize the atonement, whether it's like me actually like talking man to man with people or just being there, you know? And so it's kind of a heavy job and there's a lot of stigma and hard things about it, but you just try and be the guy that you want coming to your home.
Mm-hmm. I know. We got my dog here. She's kind of pacing around here, but dude, that's awesome. It made me think of, I don't know. And people might have a problem with me, especially people that might have negative attitudes towards police officers, but I'm just going to use you specifically in this comparison. But like if we're following Christ, right? You identify as a disciple of Christ, right? One of my favorite scriptures is I think it's 1 Nephi 19:9. And the world
Yes. And he suffereth it. Yeah.
And yeah, the world because of scorn shall spit upon him, and he suffereth it. They shall scourge him, and he suffereth it. They shall do all manner of things unto him, and he suffereth it. And like you watch The Chosen and other shows that kind of depict Jesus's life, and he walked around, and because of who he was, like people automatically didn't like him. You know, Pharisees, scribes, or you know, Hellenistic Jews, and all these different groups, and people are like, oh, that's the blasphemer, or oh, that's the bastard child, you know, or that's Jesus who's spreading. He's just trying to get popularity, or the Roman soldiers, he's trying to overthrow Rome, or whatever. And you kind of have to be willing to bear that cross in a way. You have to be willing to embrace it and be like, yeah, no matter what, I know who I am, and the world, because of judgment, because of stigma, like they're going to see me a certain way, and I have to embrace that and accept that and still handle it gracefully despite it. And that's something that I don't necessarily have to face as a therapist. That's one ways that our job are very different. Like, you know, working in the treatment center, I had to respond to stressful situations. I had to get in fights with obviously I couldn't throw punches, they're minors, but like I had to tackle kids, and I had to, you know, hold them down. I had to like dodge punches, and I got kicked in the head multiple times, punched multiple times. You know, there was a girl that was trying to swallow a screw, and as a way of self-harm, and I had to like get it out of her mouth while she's biting me. And then she's like biting my hand and stuff, made me bleed. You know, I've had people scratch me with their fingernails and that kind of stuff. But I haven't seen like bodies or anything, you know, and so you've seen that on steroids basically. But yeah, the way that I still think I understand a little bit of what that's like, just being a member of the church, because even when I was working at that treatment center, a lot of the teenagers, they really didn't like Mormons, or as
Yep.
we're called.
Yep.
Which I don't like that word.
Same.
I feel like it's
Oh,
kind of
totally.
derogatory, but I identify as a follower
Same.
of Christ. And but yeah, they automatically, they like, once they find out you're a member of the church, they're like, I don't
Yeah.
like Mormons, or I hate Mormons,
Yeah.
F the Mormons,
Yeah.
kind of stuff. And there's a lot of stigma against our
Totally.
church. There's a lot of, comments in the social media feeds. There's a lot of kind of hate and a lot of that. And I have just had to accept that comes with the
Totally.
territory.
Yeah.
And especially like putting out this podcast now, like I know inevitably when it gets bigger, I'm trying to market the podcast not just towards members of our faith, but towards other Christians, non-denominational
Sure,
Christians,
absolutely,
evangelical Christians. Like, let's build
Totally.
common ground. But I know inevitably when this gets bigger, like there's gonna be people in the comments like throwing some anti stuff and people saying you guys aren't Christian and take that cross necklace off and
Right.
all that stuff. Like, you guys aren't real Christians. You don't believe in the Trinity, or
Sure.
all these kind of stuffs. And the thought that I've had to hold on to, because I know that's coming.
Yeah.
Like, this podcast has been something that God inspired me to do. This is something that I genuinely feel called to. And so I know that this is going to get
for
bigger,
sure.
and I'm going to have a wider audience, and that it's, I'm not delusional in that. Like, I've been told like that's what's
happens.
going to happen,
Part of the
and
territory.
it's part of the territory. And Jesus Christ, when he walked this earth in his mortal life, he accepted, like, not everyone's
Right.
going to love me. People are
Right.
going to hate me, even though I love and serve them, and I am literally giving my
Right.
life for these people. Like, there's still going to be people
Right.
that hate me, and you have to be willing to bear the shame of the scorn. I kind of cringe when I see members of the church in the Instagram comments, like they're just arguing
Yeah.
back and forth, or when on the mission, when people at Bible Bash and you're just arguing with these people.
It's not going anywhere.
You kind of have to just be willing to take it. Like, people are going to say you're not Christian, and like, that doesn't matter to me when people tell me I'm not Christian. I know I'm
Absolutely.
a Christian. I have dedicated my entire life to loving and following and serving Jesus Christ. You can't tell me I'm
Absolutely.
not a Christian. Jesus Christ himself knows that I
Absolutely.
love him. He knows what's in my heart. He knows
Absolutely.
that I'm his follower, that I'm his disciple.
Completely agree.
And so whatever people want to say, dude, this is the first podcast where I've cried. It's crazy. We got 2 different times now, man.
Respect, man.
You ain't gonna see no tears. It's like the cop and Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs.
One
Like,
manly
get
tears.
back in there. Yeah, man. You aren't gonna see any tears, but
Oh, I respect it, man. Let them fly,
there's
dude.
There's
Let
a
'em
little
fly.
bit welling up, But yeah, yeah, you have to be willing to take
Yeah,
it, man.
that was something that I learned. And there's hobbies that help you learn it a little bit. Like, I did a little bit of jiu-jitsu, and I try and do it, but family life's hard. But you just got to swallow your pride, leave your ego at the door. And I've had to learn that, and I love that you brought this up about being a disciple of Jesus Christ and being a member of the Church of Jesus Christ, because I've had to learn that a lot. A lot of my coworkers and people that I work with were members and are not anymore, and I'm one of the only active guys at my police department. And a lot of them have kind of, when you leave the faith, I don't feel like it's as nice as people who aren't in the faith, because sometimes they want to validate or throw stones, and love them for who they are, because I would take a bullet for any one of them. They're great people. But yeah, like, being a member of our faith, we're attacked a lot of times. Being a police officer, we're attacked a lot of times. And not to get political, but like in society nowadays, like men are attacked, white men. I'm not gonna go down that rabbit hole, but like, there's a lot of voices in society that attack, and it happens for everybody, whatever faith, race, orientation, all of it. People are getting attacked, and I feel like we're decisive now in today's society, and that wears a lot on you, and it wears a lot on me, because I'm like, man, my religion gets attacked every day I'm at work, or every day I go on social media. My job gets attacked relentlessly anywhere I'm at. And so I take that burden on myself a lot of times, and I'm like, you know what? Like, swallow your pride. It's not about you. It's not who you are. Jesus suffered the sins. He is the one that is the messenger and God's servant, right? And he's the one that's going to be taking that on. It's not your church. It's not your belief or faith. Like, it's him. You're just a disciple of him. And then same with being a cop. Like, I am just a tool in the toolbox to help keep society safe and calm and protected and enforcing laws and consequences. It's not me. It's not personal at all for either one, right? And so remembering that kind of helps me to keep that stress and burden away. But, I'm grateful for the knowledge of Jesus Christ because, man, I could not do any of this without him or my spouse, my wife, or my daughter or family. I have nothing but gratitude for them. Am I perfect? No. Not perfect at balancing the hardship of the job, having a faith, and, being a good person. But we, even through our bad days, we can figure it out and become better and overcoming that.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that. And I hope that anyone listening to this podcast doesn't think that I'm taking sides and any kind of political ideation. I'm not.
Same.
I'm not saying blue lives matter. Obviously blue lives do matter, but I'm not supporting any one of those ideations or anything. I serve my mission in Memphis, and I had an opportunity to talk to a lot of police officers in this area that I was in Memphis, and in this particular area of Memphis, it was 90% black. Yeah. And so for the first time in my life, I'm a minority, right? The other 9% are Latino.
Just a different neighborhood.
It was me and my white companion walking around, people are like, "Are you guys lost? Do you need help?" No, this is where we want to be, actually. That opened my eyes to a lot of struggles that, black Americans do have. And, I'm not necessarily taking sides with either BLM or Blue Lives Matter or any of that, but I see both perspectives and I value both of them because, I witnessed things. I witnessed, a lack of resources and communities that were underfunded and that had systematic issues, that contributed to things like poverty and crime and all that. And so my mind is open to those sort of things. I also believe in personal accountability. Agreed. It's up to you. You can't rely on the government to make those systemic changes that are affecting you. It's up to you to pack up your, to get yourself out of certain situations, and I understand it can be hard. Oh yeah, of course it's hard. But it made me really empathetic because I don't know what it's like to walk around a grocery store and be followed by a security guard because of the color of my skin. And that's people's real valid experiences, but I also don't know what it's like to be a cop and to automatically be hated when you're a white cop, and people automatically assume that you're racist and that you want to go around killing people that have a different skin color than you, And so just being able to understand both perspectives, both sides are human beings that have real pain, that have real valid experiences. Yeah. No, I love, my black brothers and sisters, members of the black community. So grateful that I had the opportunity to serve and to be amongst them as a missionary. And because, I kind of grew up in, I grew up in New Jersey, which, I had some black friends growing up, but, you moved to Harriman, Utah, and it's
a lot of white people.
There's a lot of white people. There's Polynesians are our version of black people.
A lot of Polynesians too.
So there was a few. There was maybe 5 in Harriman when we went to high school. Sure. But but it's not the same as being in Memphis, Tennessee.
Very different.
When and so I'm so grateful for that experience because it did open my mind and it did help me see that perspective. And so if anyone's listening to thinking oh, he's supporting cops or whatever, it's no, I support human beings. I support anyone, and I want to validate anyone that feels like they have a different experience. Come on the pod and be
for sure.
I
hope that's what people take away from this discussion is that I may work as a police officer. I do not hate people, and there are a lot of good cops out there. But there are a lot of people that make poor decisions. Whatever career field you're in, right? There's doctors, accountants, politicians, whatever it may be. They make bad decisions, and does not make them a bad person, right? I think we just get publicized a lot as police officers, and we're under a microscope sometimes. And that's me as a individual who thinks that, not speaking for the community. But do I think it's important? Yeah, we have a job where we have to do some really critical things, and so we should be accountable for our actions. I think it's great. Yeah, we got to respect civil liberties. We have to respect individuals, and I think that's important. But do I think there's a lot of divisiveness in our country right now? Yeah, and I think this podcast and I think politically, morally, spiritually, whatever it may be, whatever realm you want to speak in, I think it's our opportunity as a community of individual citizens in this country and disciples of Jesus Christ to sit down and have that conversation, right? I may disagree with someone completely in every realm of life, but I can sit down and treat them like Christ would, and we can have a civil conversation. We can even be friends. And I think that's an important thing, right? Like, I think it's an important thing to put our egos aside and just realize, like, yeah, there's a face behind this title, right? There's a face behind this protester. There's a face behind this cop. There's a face behind this person, whatever they may be. Like, it's our opportunity to get to know them as who they are, see them. Like we talked about with the addiction, like the homeless individual on the street, they may have children. They may have a family. We should love them like Christ would. The rich person in the mansion, they may have struggles that we may not see. We're all equals. Treat the drug dealer like the soccer mom. Treat every person the same.
Boom. Might as well just drop that mic you're holding, bro. That was awesome. No, Eddy, this has been a really uplifting conversation.
Yeah,
I really appreciate you and your time, man. And end of the day, like, just be kind. Just love other people and turn outward to everybody and anybody. I always err on the side of giving people the benefit of the doubt. That's always just been who I am. And some people have gotten upset with that, and that's okay. But like I said, I have that perspective, like the judgment is God's. And it's my job to give them the benefit of the doubt and to be kind and compassionate. Obviously, like, there's going to be boundaries need to be held. Safety needs to be assured. But yeah, err on the side of compassion, err on the side of keeping boundaries, not at the expense of letting people get away with things that are going to hurt themselves or other people, but it's about your mindset, that your mind doesn't become poisoned with hate towards this person. I think that's what it's all about at the end of the day. So if you're watching this episode and you feel like it's blessed you or uplifted you in some way, please be sure to follow the podcast either on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It's a great way to support the podcast and help it reach more people. We also have our Instagram page, Turn Outward Podcast. You can follow that page. I'll be posting clips. And the Instagram page is one of the best ways to get the podcast more exposure. So obviously we have the Instagram algorithm. A lot of it depends on traction. So the more likes, the more comments that we can get, the more followers we can get on the page. Even if you just hit the little like send button and then just hit copy link on Instagram, that actually helps the algorithm think that that it's getting more traction. So but obviously you can post it to your story, share it with your friends, send it to people individually. Anything you can do to help share this podcast. I really want to help make a difference in the world and help heal the world with the message of Turn Outward. So thank you for being here and thank you for listening. And anything you can do to help share it is greatly appreciated. And Eddy, thank you once again for giving us your time today.
Me. I appreciate it.
I really appreciate it. You've been an amazing guest.
I appreciate the opportunity. Seriously.